A black girl sheltered a cowboy and his grandma during a vicious sandstorm, unaware they were the territory's richest family. "Please, miss, she's dying," the weathered giant pleads as desert winds howl around the trembling woman in his arms. The townsfolk of Copper Springs see the young black woman as nothing more than invisible help at the ramshackle inn, destined to scrub floors until her dying breath. But when the mysterious cowboy and his frail grandmother arrive seeking refuge, her simple act of defiance changes everything. The strangers carry secrets worth killing for, secrets that powerful men have already murdered to obtain. Their leather satchel holds documents that could either elevate the girl beyond her wildest dreams or paint a target on her back that will bring the territory's most dangerous predator straight to her door. Will her kindness become her salvation or her death sentence? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The brass bell above the Desert Rose Inn's door chimed weakly as another gust of wind rattled the weathered building. Hattie Jameson wiped sweat from her forehead and continued scrubbing the sticky floor where a drunk cowboy had spilled his whiskey the night before. The stain had set deep into the wooden planks, just like everything else in this place. Mr. Patterson emerged from behind the front desk, his round face twisted in its usual scowl. He glanced at Hattie's work and grunted his disapproval. 3 years she had worked at this inn, and he still treated her like she had started yesterday. The other employees got breaks. They got kind words when they did good work. Hattie got more chores. The morning crowd ignored her completely as she moved between tables collecting empty plates and glasses. She had become as invisible as the dust that settled on the windowsills. Sometimes she wondered if she simply vanished, whether anyone would notice before the floors started getting dirty again. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon like a dark promise. Hattie had lived in Arizona territory long enough to recognize the signs. This would be a big one, the kind that buried towns in sand and left travelers stranded for days. She carried the dirty dishes to the kitchen and began washing them in the large metal basin. Through the small window, she watched the wind pick up strength. Tumbleweeds rolled down the main street like lost spirits. The few people still outside hurried toward shelter. Patterson burst through the kitchen doors. His face had gone pale. He grabbed Hattie's arm roughly and pulled her toward the window. A massive wall of sand stretched across the entire horizon, moving toward town like a brown tidal wave. Hattie had seen storms before, but nothing like this. The wall had to be 100 feet high and miles wide. It would swallow everything in its path. The front doorbell chimed frantically. Patterson released Hattie and rushed toward the main room. She followed close behind, curiosity overcoming caution. 2 figures stood in the doorway, both covered in dust from head to toe. The larger one was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, supporting an elderly woman who could barely stand. The woman's breathing came in short, painful gasps. Her skin had turned gray with exhaustion. Patterson took one look at them and shook his head. He had made this calculation before. These travelers looked like they had no money. Desperate people rarely paid their bills. The tall man stepped forward. Beneath the dust, Hattie could see his weathered face and steady blue eyes. His clothes were simple but well made. His boots, though dirty, showed quality craftsmanship. The old woman raised her head slightly. Despite her obvious weakness, her dark eyes held sharp intelligence. She carried herself with dignity even while leaning heavily on her companion. Patterson crossed his arms over his chest. The storm was minutes away from hitting town. Anyone caught outside would be in serious danger. But the inn owner had made his decision based on appearances alone. Hattie watched the old woman sway on her feet. Her companion tightened his grip to keep her upright. They had nowhere else to go. Every other business in town would be closing their doors and boarding their windows. The first winds hit the building with enough force to rattle every window. Sand began pelting the glass like angry insects. In less than an hour, the storm would turn day into night. Anyone outside would be lost. Patterson turned away from the strangers and began closing shutters. His message was clear. They were not welcome. Hattie looked at the old woman again. Something about her reminded Hattie of her own grandmother, who had died when Hattie was 12. The same proud way of holding her head. The same refusal to show weakness even when her body was failing. The decision made itself. Hattie stepped forward and touched the man's dusty sleeve. She nodded toward the kitchen and the small room beyond where she slept. It was not much, just a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair, but it had 4 walls and a roof. Patterson spun around, his face flushing red with anger. Hattie had never directly defied him before. She was risking her job, her home, everything she had worked for, but she could not watch these people die in the storm. The tall man looked at her with surprise, then gratitude. He helped his companion toward the kitchen. The old woman managed a weak smile as they passed Hattie. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words were clear. She thanked Hattie with the refined accent of someone who had received education, not the rough speech of most travelers who passed through Copper Springs. The old woman spoke like the banker's wife or the judge's daughter. Patterson's angry shouts followed them into the kitchen, but the sound of the approaching storm drowned out his words. The wind howled like a living thing. Sand struck the windows hard enough to crack the glass. Hattie helped settle the old woman on her bed while the man stood guard by the small window. He watched the storm's approach with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. His hand rested near his hip where most men carried guns. The old woman clutched a worn leather satchel against her chest. Even in her weakened state, she guarded it carefully. Whatever was inside, she considered it more valuable than her own comfort. The storm hit with the force of a freight train. The building shook. Sand found every crack and crevice, turning the air thick and brown. For the next 3 days, nobody would be going anywhere. Hattie was trapped with 2 strangers who carried themselves like nobility but looked like common travelers. Something about them did not add up, and outside, the storm that had forced them together was about to become the least of their problems. The storm raged for 18 hours without pause. Sand hammered the windows like bullets while the wind screamed through every gap in the building. Hattie shared her meager supplies with the strangers. A loaf of day-old bread, some dried meat, and water from her personal pitcher. The old woman introduced herself as Evelyn. The tall man was Carter, her grandson. They spoke little about where they had come from or where they were going, but Hattie noticed things. Carter's hands were rough from ranch work, but his fingernails were clean. His boots were expensive leather, hand-stitched with silver buckles, the kind that cost more than Hattie made in 6 months. When he thought no one was looking, he checked a gold pocket watch with elegant engravings. Evelyn carried herself like royalty despite her exhaustion. She thanked Hattie for every kindness with formal politeness. Her speech belonged in drawing rooms, not frontier inns. Even her worn dress showed quality fabric and skilled tailoring beneath the dust. On the second day, Evelyn's condition improved enough for conversation. She asked Hattie about her life with genuine interest. Not the polite small talk of strangers, but the focused attention of someone gathering important information. Hattie found herself sharing dreams she had never spoken aloud. Her plan to save enough money to open her own boarding house. Her desire to own land where no one could tell her what to do. Evelyn listened to every word with encouraging nods. Carter watched Hattie with curious respect as she rationed their supplies and managed their small space with efficiency. When she mentioned teaching herself to read, his eyebrows rose with surprise. Few people in Copper Springs could read well. Fewer still had taught themselves. The 3rd morning brought calm. The storm had moved east, leaving behind a world transformed by sand drifts and debris. Carter prepared to venture outside to assess the damage. He rolled his shoulders and stretched muscles stiff from sleeping on the floor. Evelyn struggled to rise from the narrow bed. Her leather satchel had never left her side during their entire stay. She clutched it now as she tried to stand. The bag seemed heavier than it should be for its size. The satchel slipped from Evelyn's weakened grip. Papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Bank statements, property deeds, and legal documents spread in every direction. Hattie moved to help gather them before they could be damaged. Her eyes caught the numbers first. Dollar amounts that made no sense. 50,000 here, 200,000 there. Property holdings measured in thousands of acres rather than single lots. Then she saw the name, Brooks Cattle Company, the largest ranching operation in the territory. Hattie had heard cowboys talking about the Brooks Empire at the inn. They owned more land than some entire counties back east. Carter moved quickly to collect the papers, but Hattie had already seen too much. Her hands shook as she held a bank statement showing assets worth over $2 million, more money than everyone in Copper Springs would see in their combined lifetimes. Evelyn sank back onto the bed with a heavy sigh. The secret was out. There was no point in pretending anymore, she explained in quiet, measured words. Her late husband had built the cattle empire from nothing. They had started with a single ranch and grew it through hard work and smart investments. Carter was not just her grandson, he was the heir to the largest fortune in Arizona territory. But that was not the most shocking revelation. Evelyn reached into the scattered papers and withdrew a legal document. Her will, recently updated and properly notarized. She handed it to Hattie with steady fingers. Hattie's name appeared on the third line. Listed as the sole beneficiary of $50,000 and 500 acres of prime ranch land. The paper was real. The signatures were genuine. The legal language was clear and binding. Hattie dropped the document like it had caught fire. $50,000 was more money than she could imagine. The land alone was worth a fortune. Together, they represented a complete transformation of her life, from invisible inn-worker to wealthy landowner in a single stroke. Evelyn smiled at Hattie's shock. She had been watching the young woman for months, she explained. Not just during the storm, but for the entire time Hattie had worked at the inn. Evelyn had visited Copper Springs several times on business, always staying at other establishments, but observing the girl who worked so hard for so little recognition. She saw something in Hattie that reminded her of herself as a young woman, the same determination to rise above circumstances, the same refusal to accept limitations imposed by others, the same hunger for something better. Carter had remained silent during his grandmother's explanation, but his expression showed deep concern. He knelt beside the bed and spoke in urgent, quiet tones. The inheritance would make Hattie incredibly wealthy, but it would also make her a target. The Brooks family had enemies, powerful men who wanted their land and would kill to get it. Accepting Evelyn's gift meant accepting deadly danger. Evelyn nodded gravely. She reached for another set of documents from her satchel. These papers told a darker story, reports of mysterious deaths among wealthy landowners. Suspicious accidents that always resulted in land changing hands. A pattern of violence targeting anyone who stood in the way of territorial expansion. The man behind the deaths had a name, Marcus Thornfield. He controlled half the territory through fear and murder. He had been hunting the Brooks family for 2 years, determined to seize their empire. That was why Evelyn and Carter were traveling in disguise, why they carried their wealth in documents rather than displaying it openly. Hattie stared at the will in her hands. It represented everything she had ever wanted: freedom, security, respect, power. But it also represented a death sentence from one of the most dangerous men in the territory. The choice was hers to make. Evelyn's hands trembled as she pulled more documents from her satchel. These papers told a story written in blood and greed. 6 wealthy landowners had died in the past 2 years, all under suspicious circumstances, all with their property mysteriously transferred to Marcus Thornfield's associates shortly after their deaths. The Murphy family had been the most recent victims. Their ranch bordered Thornfield's northern holdings. James Murphy and his wife had been found dead in their burned barn, supposedly killed when a lantern exploded. Their 3 children had vanished without a trace. The property deed was filed in Thornfield's name within a week. Hattie remembered the Murphy ranch. She had served James Murphy coffee at the inn just months ago. He was a careful man who never smoked or drank. The idea that he would handle fire carelessly made no sense. Carter's jaw tightened as Evelyn spread more evidence across the bed. His father had been Thornfield's first victim. Thomas Brooks had discovered Thornfield's illegal cattle rustling operation and threatened to report him to the territorial authorities. 3 days later, Thomas Brooks was found dead on a remote trail, supposedly thrown from his horse. But Carter had examined his father's body personally. The injuries were wrong for a riding accident. Thomas Brooks had been beaten to death and then dragged behind a horse to hide the evidence. Carter had been a deputy sheriff then. trained to read the signs of violence. He knew murder when he saw it. The local sheriff refused to investigate. Too many important people vouched for Thornfield's character. Too much money changed hands in dark corners. Carter resigned his badge rather than participate in the cover-up. Since then, he had devoted his life to protecting his grandmother and gathering evidence against Thornfield. But evidence meant nothing without a forum to present it. Every local official was either bought or intimidated. The territorial government was hundreds of miles away and corrupted by railroad money. Evelyn pulled out a leather journal filled with her careful handwriting. For 2 years, she had documented every suspicious death and property transfer. She had traced the network of corrupt officials who enabled Thornfield's crimes. She had identified the railroad executives who profited from stolen land grants. The journal contained enough evidence to hang Thornfield and a dozen of his associates. But it also contained their death warrants if the wrong people discovered it. Hattie studied the journal pages with growing amazement. The scope of the conspiracy stretched across the entire territory. Judges, sheriffs, land office clerks. Even some federal appointees were involved. Thornfield had built a criminal empire protected by purchased justice. She noticed something the others had missed. The pattern of deaths followed the stagecoach routes she knew by heart. Thornfield's men used the same roads and stopping points that honest travelers used. They knew exactly when and where to find their victims because they controlled the flow of information through corrupt postal workers and innkeepers. Carter leaned forward with sharp interest as Hattie traced the routes on a hand-drawn map. Her knowledge was encyclopedic. 3 years of listening to travelers at the inn had given her detailed information about every trail, water source, and safe house in the region. She knew which judges could be trusted and which were bought. She knew which sheriffs were honest and which were Thornfield's men. Most importantly, she knew the back routes that avoided populated areas entirely. Evelyn watched Hattie with growing excitement. The young woman possessed exactly the local knowledge they needed to reach the territorial capital safely. More than that, she had the intelligence to understand the legal complexities of their evidence. But Hattie's strategic mind was already working on a larger problem. Even if they reached the capital, presenting evidence would not be enough. Thornfield had allies in the territorial government. He could claim the documents were forgeries. He could discredit their testimony by pointing to their personal motives for revenge. They needed more than evidence. They needed a trap. Hattie spread out a territorial map and began marking locations with a pencil stub. Her plan was audacious and dangerous. Instead of running to the capital, they would draw Thornfield out by making him believe he had cornered them. They would use his greed and arrogance against him. The plan required precise timing and perfect knowledge of the terrain. They would need allies in unexpected places. Most importantly, they would need Thornfield to incriminate himself in front of witnesses he could not buy or intimidate. Carter studied Hattie's marked map with professional appreciation. Her strategy was sound. The routes she had chosen avoided Thornfield's known strongholds while providing multiple escape options. She had identified neutral ground where honest officials might still hold authority. Evelyn smiled with fierce satisfaction. She had chosen her heir well. Hattie possessed not just intelligence and determination, but the tactical mind needed to survive in a corrupt world. The inheritance was an investment in the future, not just charity for a deserving young woman. Outside, voices carried across the inn's main room. Patterson was arguing with someone about storm damage and delayed supplies, but underneath his complaints, Hattie detected a different tone. Fear. Carter moved silently to the small window and peered through a gap in the shutters. 3 men on horseback were questioning Patterson in the inn's front yard. They wore the dust of hard travel and the confident swagger of hired guns. Their leader was asking about strangers who might have taken shelter during the storm. Thornfield's men had found them. The hunters had become the hunted. But now the prey was armed with knowledge, determination, and a plan that could destroy their pursuer forever. The real game was about to begin. Carter pressed his eye to the shutter gap and counted the riders. 3 men, all armed, asking too many questions. Their leader wore a silver badge that meant nothing. Thornfield owned half the sheriff's deputies in the territory. Hattie gathered the scattered documents with swift efficiency. Every paper disappeared into Evelyn's satchel within seconds. She moved with the practiced silence of someone who had learned to be invisible when dangerous men came calling. Evelyn struggled to her feet, one hand pressed against her chest. The stress was taking its toll on her weak heart. Her breathing came in short, painful gasps, but her eyes remained sharp and determined. The back door of the inn opened onto an alley that connected to the old mining road. Hattie had used that route countless times to avoid Patterson when he was drunk and angry. Now it would serve a more desperate purpose. Carter helped his grandmother through the narrow kitchen while Hattie checked the alley for watchers. The coast was clear, but it would not stay that way long. Thornfield's men would search every room in the inn within minutes. They slipped out into the blazing afternoon sun. The storm had left everything covered in a fine layer of sand, but the sky was crystal clear. No cover from weather this time. They would have to rely on speed and Hattie's knowledge of hidden paths. The abandoned Copper Creek mine lay 5 miles north of town. Hattie had explored its tunnels as a child, before the adults realized how dangerous they were. The main shaft was unstable, but the old foreman's office was built into solid rock. It would provide shelter while they planned their next move. Evelyn's condition worsened with each step. The heat and exertion were draining her remaining strength. Carter supported most of her weight, but their pace slowed to a crawl. At this rate, Thornfield's men would catch them before they reached cover. Hattie disappeared into a cluster of rocks and returned leading 3 horses. 2 were sturdy ranch animals. The third was an elegant black mare with silver tack. All bore the Brooks family brand. Carter stared in amazement. These were their own horses, stolen when Thornfield's men ambushed their camp 3 days ago. How had Hattie found them? She explained quickly while helping Evelyn into the saddle. The horses had been stabled behind the livery stable, hidden but not well guarded. Hattie had noticed them during her morning errands and recognized the distinctive Brooks brand from the family documents. The theft was risky but necessary. On foot, they were easy prey. On horseback, they could reach the mine before their pursuers organized a proper search. Hattie's bold move had probably saved their lives. They rode hard toward the mine, following deer trails and dry creek beds that would not hold hoofprints. Evelyn clung to her saddle with grim determination, refusing to slow their escape despite her obvious pain. The old mine buildings appeared like a mirage in the desert heat. Most of the structures had collapsed years ago, but the foreman's office remained intact. Its stone walls and narrow windows made it defensible if necessary. Inside, Evelyn collapsed onto a dusty cot while Carter checked their supplies. They had water for 2 days, food for 1. Not enough for a prolonged siege, but adequate for planning their next move. Hattie studied the territorial map by lamplight while Evelyn transferred legal ownership of her inheritance. The documents were complex, but Evelyn explained each clause with patient thoroughness. $50,000 and 500 acres would officially belong to Hattie within hours. The weight of such wealth felt surreal. Yesterday, Hattie had scrubbed floors for pocket change. Tonight, she was richer than everyone she had ever known combined. The transformation would take time to accept. But wealth meant nothing if they did not survive to enjoy it. Thornfield's reach extended throughout the territory. His corruption network could track them anywhere they tried to hide. Running would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Carter suggested riding to Mexico, where Thornfield's influence was limited. They could wait there while federal marshals investigated the evidence. But Evelyn shook her head firmly. Running meant abandoning other potential victims to Thornfield's schemes. The old woman's moral clarity was absolute. They would not save themselves by allowing others to die. Justice delayed was justice denied. The evidence must reach honest authorities quickly, before more innocent families suffered. Hattie proposed a different strategy entirely. Instead of running or hiding, they would force Thornfield to come to them, but not here, where his men held every advantage. They would choose the battlefield and set the terms of engagement. Judge William Harrison lived in Prescott, 60 miles northwest. He was one of the few territorial officials with an unblemished reputation. More importantly, he conducted court sessions in public, where witnesses could not disappear quietly. The route to Prescott crossed some of the most dangerous terrain in Arizona: desert, mountains, and narrow canyon passes where ambushes were easily arranged. But those same hazards could work against pursuers who did not know the land intimately. Evelyn clutched Hattie's hand with surprising strength. The inheritance was more than money and land. It was a responsibility to use wealth for good, to protect the innocent and punish the guilty, to ensure that other young women would have opportunities that had been denied to previous generations. As night fell over the desert, they finalized their desperate plan. Tomorrow, they would split up for safety. Carter would take the mountain route with the horses, drawing Thornfield's men away from the women. Hattie and Evelyn would travel the old Apache trail on foot, carrying the evidence toward justice. It was a dangerous gamble that could easily end in disaster. But doing nothing guaranteed their deaths and Thornfield's continued reign of terror. Sometimes the greatest risk was taking no risk at all. The stars appeared one by one in the clear desert sky, bright and cold as diamonds. Somewhere out there, evil men were planning their destruction. But tonight, 3 unlikely allies had become a family bound by shared danger and common purpose. Dawn broke over the desert with merciless clarity. No clouds offered shelter from the blazing sun that would make their journey a test of endurance. Evelyn's breathing had grown more labored during the night, but she insisted on continuing with the plan. Carter prepared to leave first, leading all 3 horses to create obvious tracks heading toward the mountain passes. Thornfield's men would follow the most visible trail, giving Hattie and Evelyn precious time to reach their destination undetected. Before mounting his horse, Carter pulled Hattie aside. His weathered face showed deep concern as he pressed a small derringer into her hands. The weapon was elegant and deadly, with pearl handles and silver engravings. It held only 2 shots, but at close range it would stop any man. Hattie had never held a gun before. The weight felt strange and terrible in her palms. Carter showed her the safety mechanism and how to aim, but they both knew that shooting accurately required practice she did not have. Evelyn watched the brief lesson with sad understanding. Violence might be unavoidable despite their careful planning. The innocent girl who had sheltered strangers in a storm was learning the harsh realities of survival in a corrupt world. Carter mounted his horse and rode north toward the mountains, deliberately leaving clear tracks in the soft sand. Within an hour, dust clouds on the horizon showed that Thornfield's men were following exactly as expected. Hattie and Evelyn began their own journey on foot, following a nearly invisible path that wound between rocky outcroppings. The ancient Apache trail showed little sign of use, but Hattie knew it led directly to the main road near Prescott. They walked slowly to accommodate Evelyn's failing strength. Every few hundred yards, the old woman needed to rest in whatever shade they could find. Her lips were turning blue despite the desert heat, and her hands shook with more than exhaustion. By midday, they reached an abandoned way station that had once served stagecoach travelers. The building was little more than 4 stone walls and a collapsed roof, but it offered protection from the blazing sun. Evelyn collapsed gratefully in the meager shade. While Evelyn rested, Hattie climbed to the station's lookout point and scanned the surrounding terrain with field glasses Carter had left them. No dust clouds marked their back trail. No riders were visible on the distant roads. Their deception was working, but something else caught her attention. A single rider approached from the east, following the main road toward their position. The distance was too great to identify the horseman, but his route would bring him directly to their hiding place. Hattie helped Evelyn to her feet and led her to a cluster of boulders 50 yards from the station. If the approaching rider was hostile, they could remain hidden until he passed. If he was friendly, they could still observe him safely before revealing themselves. The rider drew closer with steady purpose. His horse was a magnificent gray stallion, and his clothes suggested wealth and education rather than frontier roughness. As he neared the station, Hattie could see his face clearly through the field glasses. Judge William Harrison himself approached their hideout. Evelyn's reaction was not relief, but sudden fear. Harrison was supposed to be in Prescott, presiding over court sessions. His presence here could only mean that their plan had been discovered. Thornfield's corruption might extend even to the one official they had trusted. The judge dismounted and walked directly toward their hiding place among the rocks. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where to look. Their concealment was no concealment at all, but instead of drawing a weapon or calling for hidden associates, Harrison removed his hat and spoke in a calm, respectful voice. He asked them to come out safely because he had important information to share. Information that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. Evelyn emerged from behind the rocks with Hattie's support. Her expression was wary but not panicked. Something in Harrison's manner suggested alliance rather than threat. But years of running from Thornfield's agents had taught her to trust no one completely. Harrison's revelation came in careful, measured words that reshaped their entire understanding of recent events. He was not just an honest judge trying to help them reach safety. He was Carter's uncle, his mother's younger brother, and he had been working with them all along. The entire escape from Copper Springs had been an elaborate performance designed to gather evidence against Thornfield. Harrison had been coordinating with federal marshals for months, building a case that would destroy Thornfield's entire criminal network. Evelyn's satchel of documents was important, but it was only one piece of a larger investigation. Harrison and his allies had been tracking Thornfield's activities across multiple territories, connecting his local crimes to a massive railroad fraud involving stolen government land grants. The plan had always been to draw Thornfield out through a carefully staged manhunt. Carter's role was to lead Thornfield's men into a trap in the mountains, where federal agents were waiting in ambush. Meanwhile, Harrison would escort Evelyn and Hattie safely to Prescott for the final legal proceedings. Hattie felt a mixture of relief and betrayal. Their desperate flight had been orchestrated from the beginning. Her inheritance was real. But her role in their escape had been planned rather than accidental. She was not just a random beneficiary, but a carefully chosen ally in a complex scheme for justice. Evelyn reached for Hattie's hand with apologetic eyes. The deception had been necessary to protect everyone involved. Too many previous witnesses against Thornfield had died mysterious deaths. Only by appearing to be helpless fugitives could they get close enough to destroy his organization completely. The sound of distant gunfire echoed from the northern mountains. Carter's part of the plan was reaching its climax. Federal marshals were engaging Thornfield's men in a battle that would end the reign of terror that had plagued the territory for years. Harrison helped Evelyn onto his horse while explaining the final phase of their operation. Tomorrow, Thornfield himself would be arrested in a public ceremony that would expose the full extent of his crimes to territorial newspapers and federal investigators. Justice was finally within reach. The courthouse in Prescott filled with curious townspeople as news of the extraordinary session spread through the streets. Judge Harrison had announced that evidence of territorial corruption would be presented in open court, with federal marshals in attendance to make arrests. Hattie stood at the prosecution table, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. 3 days of preparation had transformed her from a frightened fugitive into a confident witness. The inheritance documents were properly filed, making her one of the wealthiest landowners in Arizona territory. Evelyn sat in the front row. Her breathing labored, but her eyes bright with anticipation. The long journey had weakened her body, but her spirit burned with the fierce satisfaction of approaching justice. Beside her, Carter bore fresh scratches from his mountain adventure, but his grim smile told the story of success. Thornfield's capture had been swift and decisive. Federal marshals had surrounded his hideout, while his men were scattered chasing decoys through the canyons. Without his hired guns to protect him, the would-be land baron had surrendered without resistance. Now he sat in shackles at the defendant's table, his arrogance replaced by desperate calculation. His expensive clothes could not disguise the fear in his eyes as he realized the scope of evidence arrayed against him. Judge Harrison called the session to order with ceremonial gravity. The packed courtroom fell silent as Hattie rose to present the case that would reshape territorial law enforcement. Her voice carried clearly to every corner of the room. She began with the Murphy family murders, describing the evidence that proved arson and premeditated killing. The supposed lantern accident was impossible given the burn patterns and the family's careful habits. Thornfield had ordered their deaths to seize valuable ranch land. Document by document, Hattie laid out the network of corruption that had protected Thornfield's crimes, bought sheriffs, intimidated witnesses, forged land transfers, and mysterious deaths that always benefited the same criminal organization. The audience gasped as she revealed the scope of the conspiracy: 6 wealthy families murdered for their property. Dozens of officials taking bribes to falsify records, federal land grants stolen through fraudulent railroad schemes worth millions of dollars. Carter took the stand to describe his father's murder and the subsequent cover-up. His testimony was precise and devastating, delivered with the authority of a former lawman who understood criminal evidence. Every detail of Thornfield's guilt was documented and verified. Evelyn's journal provided the final pieces of the puzzle. 2 years of careful investigation had traced every connection in Thornfield's network. Names, dates, financial records, and witness statements created an unbreakable chain of evidence. Thornfield's defense attorney made a desperate attempt to discredit the witnesses by attacking their motives. But the evidence was too overwhelming and the federal support too obvious. Even corrupt local officials could not ignore such clear proof of guilt. The judge's verdict was swift and comprehensive. Thornfield was found guilty of multiple murders, land fraud, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy against the territorial government. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. His network of corrupt associates received equally harsh punishments. Bought sheriffs lost their badges and faced federal prosecution. Crooked land office clerks were arrested for falsifying records. Railroad executives were charged with conspiracy to defraud the government. The courtroom erupted in cheers as justice was finally served. Families of Thornfield's victims wept with relief and gratitude. Honest citizens celebrated the end of a reign of terror that had threatened everyone who stood in the wrong man's way. But the day's revelations were not finished. Judge Harrison stood to make an additional announcement that surprised even the federal marshals. The Brooks family had petitioned the territorial government to establish a special fund for Thornfield's victims. All recovered stolen property would be returned to rightful owners or their surviving families. Compensation would be provided for families destroyed by Thornfield's crimes. Most importantly, new laws would protect honest citizens from future land grab schemes. Hattie's inheritance was just the beginning of her new responsibilities. Evelyn had chosen her not just for her character, but for her potential to use wealth for the benefit of others. The money and land came with the obligation to prevent future injustices. That evening, as the crowds dispersed and official business concluded, Evelyn asked to speak privately with Hattie. They sat together on the courthouse steps, watching the sun set over the town that had just witnessed the triumph of justice over corruption. Evelyn's breathing was growing weaker by the hour. The excitement and stress of the trial had taken their toll on her failing heart. But her voice remained strong as she shared her final wishes with the young woman who had become like a daughter to her. The inheritance was not charity, but an investment in the future. Hattie possessed the intelligence, determination, and moral clarity needed to build something lasting from the Brooks family wealth. A school for young women who needed education and opportunity. A sanctuary for families threatened by powerful enemies. 3 days later, Evelyn Brooks died peacefully in her sleep at the Prescott Hotel. Her funeral drew hundreds of mourners, including many people whose lives had been saved by her courage in exposing Thornfield's crimes. Hattie inherited everything as promised: $50,000, 500 acres of prime ranch land, and the respect of an entire community that had witnessed her transformation from invisible in-worker to powerful advocate for justice. Carter remained as her business partner and ranch manager, their relationship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Together, they established the Evelyn Brooks School for Young Women, providing education and opportunities for girls who might otherwise remain invisible. The Desert Rose Inn became Hattie's first business acquisition. She transformed it into a proper hotel where all travelers were welcome regardless of their appearance or apparent wealth. The small room where she had once sheltered strangers became a shrine to the power of kindness. On quiet evenings, Hattie would sit on her ranch porch and remember the storm that had changed everything. A simple act of compassion had revealed hidden wealth, exposed deadly corruption, and created a legacy that would benefit generations of young women who dared to dream beyond their circumstances.